You know what it's like to be counted out before you've even had a chance to try. To watch people's faces shift when they hear what you've decided to do with what little you have left. Everyone around you is certain you've made a mistake, but you're the only one who has to live with it either way. Here's where it begins. The heat came first, before the story even had a name. By July of 1988, the thermometer nailed to the porch post of half the farmhouses in Independence County, Arkansas, had stopped meaning anything. It simply sat there past 100 degrees day after day, like a gauge that had given up. The creek beds cracked into long gray puzzle pieces. Cattle stood motionless in the shade of dying oaks, ribs showing through hide, tails swatting at flies with less and less conviction. Corn that should have stood shoulder high by the 4th of July had curled into brittle question marks, leaves rattling like paper in a wind that offered no relief, only more heat. Farmers drove their trucks slow down the county roads that summer, windows down, elbows out, watching their neighbors' fields the way a man watches a fire he can't put out. Tractors sat idle in barns because there was nothing left worth cutting. Hay was trucked in from 3 states away and sold at prices that made grown men go quiet at the feed store counter. And then there was the Sutter place, 80 acres on the edge of white river bottom land, and by every account, it shouldn't have been any different from the farms around it. Same drought, same sun, same empty rain gauge nailed to the same kind of porch post. But drive past the Sutter farm that July, and the color was wrong. Not green like spring, but not the bleached, defeated brown choking every other field for 10 miles either. Something darker held on beneath the stress. Something underneath the surface was refusing to quit. People noticed. People always notice the thing that doesn't fit. The woman who owned that farm was Verna Sutter, a widow in her early 50s, who, the winter before, had spent months doing something the whole county considered either foolish or half-mad. She had buried 12,000 fish heads across her land. Nobody could explain why her fields were still standing while everyone else's were dying. And before this story is finished, you'll understand exactly why, but not yet. Not until Verna herself understood it. If you enjoy these forgotten corners of American farming history, the strange decisions nobody understood until it was too late to laugh, go ahead and hit like on this one. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the Acre Archive. We dig up stories like this one every week, and you won't want to miss what's buried next. Now, rewind the clock back to the fall of 1987, before anyone in Independence County had heard the word drought attached to the coming year. Back to when Verna Sutter was just a widow trying to keep 80 acres from swallowing her whole. Her husband Dale had died the previous winter, quick and unexpected, a heart that gave out while he was replacing a fence post on the North 40. Dale had been the farmer between the two of them, the one who could read a field like scripture, who knew which 40 needed lime and which needed rest. Verna had kept the books, raised their 2 children, and worked beside him for 26 years. But everyone in town, quietly, in the way small towns do, assumed she'd sell within a year. A widow alone couldn't run 80 acres. Not with the debt Dale had left behind on the equipment. Not with 2 mortgage payments still due each spring on land that had been fighting them for a decade already. She wasn't naive about what she was facing. The East Fields, the ones Dale had pushed hardest for cotton and soybeans through the 70s, had thinned out. Organic matter down to almost nothing. Compacted where the same tractor had worked the same rows season after season. The soil didn't hold water the way it used to. It sheeted off in a hard rain or turned to dust within a week of a dry spell. Fertilizer costs climbed every year, while yields crept the other direction. She couldn't outbuy the problem. She'd run the math a dozen times on the kitchen table with Dale's old ledger open in front of her, and buying her way out with more commercial nitrogen simply wasn't there. She needed something else. She just didn't know what yet. And what she'd eventually decide would take root in ground nobody else wanted to touch. What she had was memory. Her father, dead now going on 15 years, had farmed through the Depression and never once let anything organic go to waste. Ash from the wood stove went to the garden. Hog manure got worked into the corn ground every fall. Leaves, corn stalks, kitchen scraps, even the blood and offal from butchering, all of it went back into the dirt eventually. Nothing that once lived is worthless once it's dead, he used to say, so long as you know where to put it. Verna had heard that line 100 times as a girl and never thought much of it. Now, staring at fields that couldn't hold a decent bean crop, she thought of little else. It was her cousin Roy, who ran a small commercial fish cleaning operation down near the White River, catfish mostly buffalo and gar when the nets came up mixed, who gave her the idea without meaning to. Roy complained one Sunday dinner about the mess he had to haul off every week, barrels of fish heads and guts, more than he could give away to hog farmers, more than the dump wanted to take. Cost me near as much to get rid of it as I make cleaning the fish, he grumbled. Verna asked him, almost without thinking, whether he'd let her have some of it. She didn't know yet that the question would take up the next 5 months of her life. She started small, a truckload of a few hundred heads that October hauled home under a stretch tarp that did little against the smell. She dug shallow trenches in the worst section of the East 40. Ground so poor, even the weeds had thinned out. The spade work was slow and dirt packed hard from years of the same tractor tracks, and she'd stop every few trenches to catch her breath, forearms burning, gloves soaked through. She learned to work upwind. She learned just as fast that there wasn't always an upwind. Flies found her within minutes, no matter how quick she moved, and she'd cover each trench the moment it was full, tamping the dirt down hard before the smell could settle into her clothes, into the truck cab. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached in ways it hadn't since she was young. Some evenings, she'd sit on the tailgate afterward with dirt under her nails and a fish scent no amount of lye soap would cut, and she'd wonder, plainly, whether she'd lost her mind. But she kept going. A few hundred became 1,000. 1,000 became 2. By December, word had gotten around the feed store, the way word always does in a county that's small. Men who'd known Dale for 30 years started asking Verna questions with a particular tone, not cruel, exactly, but close to it. One neighbor told her straight out, right there by the counter, that fish belonged in the river, not in the dirt, and that she was going to poison her own well before spring. Another cracked a joke about her farm turning into a fish cemetery, and it made the rounds at the diner, growing a little with each telling. A woman at church suggested, gently but pointedly, that grief did strange things to a person, and maybe Verna ought to see somebody about it. Verna didn't argue with any of them. She simply nodded, said her thank yous, and went back to digging. But she kept asking herself the same question the whole county was asking out loud, whether she actually knew something they didn't, or whether she was about to lose the last of what Dale had left her. By January, the number had passed 5,000. By late February 8, she wasn't only burying fish heads by then. She'd started layering in composted manure from her small herd of cattle, crop residue she'd been chopping and disking under instead of burning, with stove ash, even leaves raked from the tree line and hauled out by the wagon load until the trailer springs sagged under the weight of it. She stopped plowing those sections deep, working the ground as little as possible so whatever she built wouldn't get torn apart again come spring. It wasn't one trick. It was a whole system stitched together from things her father had done without ever giving it a name, aimed at one goal, not feeding this year's crop, but rebuilding what the soil itself could hold on to. The 12,000 fish head went into the ground the second week of March 1988. Verna stood at the edge of the field afterward, filthy, exhausted, hands raw, unsure whether she'd just spent a winter saving her farm or wasting the only strength she had left to give it. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to like the video and drop a comment. We'd love to know if you've ever heard of anything like this from your own family's farming history. And if forgotten, agricultural stories like this one are your thing. Subscribing to the Acre Archive means you won't miss the next one. Spring planting came, and for a while, it looked like the doubters might be right after all. The treated ground didn't transform overnight. Some rows came up uneven. In a few low spots, the seedlings looked no better, worse even than the untreated sections nearby. Verna walked those fields some mornings with a knot in her stomach, running numbers in her head that never came out favorable. She had put everything into this labor, time, the last of her savings on top of what little the fish and hauling had cost, and by late April, she genuinely didn't know if any of it had been worth it. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table with Dale's ledger and cried quietly, the way you cry when you're the only one left to see it. She almost called the realtor twice that month. Both times she hung up before it rang. Then the rain stopped. It didn't announce itself as anything unusual at first. A dry week in early May wasn't strange for Arkansas. Then a second week without rain, then a third. By June, the gauge on Verna's porch, same as every porch in the county, sat bone dry, and the sky stayed a hard, cloudless blue that farmers had started to dread rather than welcome. Nobody in Independence County knew it yet, but they were standing at the front edge of one of the worst droughts in a generation. The drought tightened around the county like a fist. Ponds that had never gone dry in living memory shrank to muddy puddles ringed with cracked mud. Pastures turned the color of a paper bag. Farmers who'd never sold off cattle before started trucking them to auction because they couldn't afford the hay to keep them fed, and the sale barns ran longer hours than anyone could remember. The bank in town, patient in ordinary years, started sending letters that weren't patient at all. Men who'd laughed at Verna Sutter over coffee in January stopped laughing about much of anything by July, and that's when the difference in her field started to show. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody driving past would have called a miracle, but the soil beneath the surface on her. Treated ground stayed darker, cooler. When she pushed her hand past the dry crust on top, the cracks, splitting every other field in the county into jagged plates, barely showed up on hers. Her corn was stressed, leaves curling in the worst heat of the afternoon, but it was standing. It was alive. 20 yards over the property line, a neighbor's corn had already given up entirely, stalks gone the color of straw. People who'd once slowed their trucks to shake their heads at the widow burying fish heads started slowing their trucks for a different reason now. They looked over her fence line a little longer than they used to. A few stopped and got out, boots crunching on ground that hadn't gone fully to dust the way theirs had. One man, the same one who'd made the fish cemetery joke back in the winter, stood at her gate along while before finally walking up the drive to ask her, plainly, what she'd done. Word reached the county extension office not long after. A young agricultural agent named Harlan Voss drove out that August to see for himself, curious enough about what the neighbors were saying to bring soil probes and a notebook. He worked methodically, driving the probe into Verna's treated ground first, twisting it free, breaking the core apart in his palm to check the color and the crumb of it. Then he walked 20 yards to the untreated section of her own farm and did the same. Then he crossed the fence line and took a third sample from a neighboring farm that had nothing to do with fish heads at all, just to be sure he wasn't imagining a difference that wasn't there. He wasn't. The organic matter in her treated soil tested measurably higher. The structure held together in a firm, dark crumble under his boot instead of caving to powder like the other samples did. Where it counted most, in a summer like this one, that soil simply held on to moisture longer than ground stripped bare season after season. What he found wasn't magic, and he said so plainly, standing there in her field with dirt still on his hands. The fish heads hadn't stopped the drought. Nothing could have stopped the drought. What Verna had built, one blistered, mocked, exhausting month at a time, was a soil that could hold on to what little water there was and put it to use instead of losing it. By harvest, the difference had turned from curiosity into fact. Neighboring farms across the county reported some of the worst yields in memory. Corn abandoned outright in places, soybeans barely worth the diesel it cost to run the combine through them. Verna's treated acreage brought in a harvest nobody would call a triumph in an ordinary year, but in 1988, it was something closer to a miracle to everyone watching her wagon come unloaded while so many others sat empty. Enough corn, enough beans to sell for real money at a time when real money was almost nowhere to be found in the county. It was enough to make the note payment that had been hanging over her since Dale's death. Enough to fix the tractor held together with wire and prayer for 2 winters. Enough, most of all, to keep the bank from ever sending another one of those letters. The man who joked about the fish cemetery came back one more time that October after the last of the harvest was in. He stood in the same spot at her gate, hat in his hands, and told her plainly he'd been wrong. Verna didn't gloat. She never had it in her, too. She just looked out over the field that had nearly broken her and said the only thing that felt true. The land remembers what you give back to it. She didn't need to say anything more than that, and he didn't ask her to. In the years that followed, the story of the widow and her 12,000 fish heads became one of those tales the county told and retold, a little differently each time, the way these things do. Some remembered the number wrong. Some forgot which year the drought had hit. But the core of it stayed the same, passed along at feed stores and church suppers for a generation after. A woman nobody expected much from had looked at what everyone else called waste and seen something worth saving instead. Fish to soil, soil to survival, survival to memory. It's a small story, one field in one dry summer in one county most people have never heard of, but it's the kind of forgotten American farming wisdom this channel exists to dig. Back up. If this one stuck with you, do us a favor and like the video. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share it with somebody who'd appreciate it. And subscribe to the Acre Archive so you don't miss the next forgotten story we uncover. Verna Sutter buried 12,000 fish heads through a mocking winter, and it saved her farm when the drought of 1988 came. Tell us where you're watching from. And be honest, have you ever kept going with something everyone told you to quit, the way Verna did with that phone in her hand? We love reading every single comment you leave us. Until next time, take care.